"Stop right there!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the shimmering waters. That morning I'd watched from my creaking porch as a line of SUVs rumbled onto my land, ignoring the small sign that read private property. They didn't care. The homeowners association had big plans, and apparently they involved my quiet lakeside hideaway. For years I'd lived in peaceful seclusion, content with fishing at dawn and strolling beneath pine trees at dusk. All that changed when the HOA declared my Lakeshore perfect for an exclusive resort. Before I could react, construction crews hammered stakes into the ground. But there's something they don't know, something even I only discovered by accident. My presence here holds a strange, unseen power. Want to find out more? Stick around and comment below where you're watching from. Trust me, this is the kind of showdown you won't want to miss, because this battle just began. I took a slow breath, looking at the tall silhouettes emerging from those SUVs, men in tailored suits, women carrying file folders, and a crew of laborers hefting machinery toward the edge of the lake. An expensive watch glimmered on the wrist of the man who appeared to be in charge. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his posture screamed unshakable confidence. I recognized that type immediately, a person who'd bulldoze anyone or anything to accomplish a goal. The letters HOA were emblazoned on the side of one of the trucks, confirming my suspicions. For the last couple of decades, my old family cabin and the surrounding property had been my refuge. I'd inherited this land from my grandfather, who had insisted it remain pristine. Granddad believed nature wasn't just pretty scenery, it was alive, with its own pulse, secrets, and perhaps a touch of magic. As a kid, I'd thought he was just telling stories, but over the years, I'd sensed something. The quiet rustle of leaves when there was no wind, the reflection on the water that showed things no one else saw, the deep ache in my bones when the weather changed. I couldn't put it into words, but the land spoke to me, and in strange ways, it listened. The HOA had tried contacting me before, sending letters that I burned in the fire pit out back without reading beyond the first line. I wanted no part of their committees, monthly dues, or their uniform approach to living. My cabin wasn't in a uniform row of suburban tract housing, so their attempts to rope me in had always been ridiculous. Now, it was more than an attempt, it was a full-on invasion. They were planning an exclusive resort, or so the rumors said. I suppose they'd convinced themselves my property was the perfect crown jewel for a flashy development project. I knew I had rights. As far as I was concerned, nobody could just stroll in here and build without my permission. But when I confronted them, they brandished complicated documents filled with legal jargon about eminent domain, public interest, subclauses, and other fancy terms. My immediate response was disbelief. Could they truly do that? The man with the expensive watch gave me an oily smile, as though he were used to dealing with people he considered ignorant. He said, "Don't worry, we'll compensate you handsomely. The entire community stands to benefit." He extended his hand. I didn't take it. Instead, I stared him down, still struggling to contain my anger. Then, trying my best to keep cool, I said, "I'm not looking for any payout. This land isn't for sale. You can't just come here and build your playground on my lakeshore." He flashed that same smug expression. "Sir, we have approval from the local municipality. All the paperwork's in order. My crew will set up the preliminary offices near the water. This place is about to become a top-tier destination, and we'll let you stay in the guest suite if you'd like." His sarcasm was obvious. By then, the workers were already unloading equipment. I clenched my fists. I wanted to physically stop them, but that would have been a bad move. As furious as I was, I knew that I couldn't wage a one-person war against an entire association, especially when they had documents, local support, and a legal team behind them. I turned around and stomped back inside my cabin, my heart pounding. I didn't know how I would fight this, but I did know I couldn't let them destroy the land my grandfather had loved. That's when the words he used to whisper came rushing back. "The lake knows," he would say. "It watches over us, and if you listen carefully, it might even help you." As a teenager, I rolled my eyes at such notions. Now I felt an odd tingle down my spine, recalling the subtle shifts in the lake's reflection. Sometimes I saw shapes on its surface that didn't match reality. Other times the breeze carried murmured messages that set me on edge. Could it be that the land really did hold some form of power? I didn't get an immediate answer, but I decided I needed help. Real help. My mind jumped to my longtime friend and neighbor, Jody. Well, neighbor was a stretch. She lived about 5 miles down the old logging road, but around here that was practically next door. She was a forestry expert working with various environmental agencies. If anyone could guide me on the laws surrounding land preservation, it was her. I hopped into my beat-up truck and rattled off across the bumpy trail. The overhead pines loomed and dust billowed in the rearview mirror. With each bump, I thought about how everything was changing. The quiet sanctuary I called home was no longer quiet. I could already hear the distant hum of machinery cutting into the earth. My stomach twisted in knots. When I arrived at Jody's place, the midday sun was filtering through tall cedar trees. Her yard featured neat rows of tomatoes and bell peppers and a wooden arch draped with vines. She'd moved here about 10 years earlier, wanting an escape from city life. Over time, she had become like a sister to me. I rapped on the front door. She answered in cargo pants and a flannel shirt, typical Jody attire. "Hey," she said, seeing my anxious face. "What's going on?" "HOA has come," I replied simply. "They're building a resort right on my property, or at least they're trying to." She shook her head incredulously. "But your property is outside any official homeowners association boundary. That's insane." "Evidently not to them. They claim they have some legal route to do it," I said, stepping inside. Her living room smelled of fresh brewed coffee. I took a seat on her couch. "They've shown up with a crew and paperwork. It's all pretty official." Jody grabbed a legal pad and a pen. "We'll figure this out. I know the county codes and environmental statutes. They can't just plow over private land for a resort unless there's a major public interest or some environmental reason. Also, the lake has protected species, if I'm not mistaken, like that rare salamander and those migrating birds that nest in the area." She started scribbling notes. "I'll make some calls to the Fish and Wildlife Department," she continued, her brow furrowed. "If there's a nesting ground or an endangered species, they'll need special permits. And if they don't have those permits, maybe we can shut them down." I nodded, feeling a surge of hope. Yet I also recalled that gleam in the project manager's eye. He seemed so certain everything was squared away. "I appreciate it," I said. "I just hope we aren't up against unstoppable forces." Jody gave me a determined smile. "Don't worry, we'll tackle this logically." She reached for her phone. "Meanwhile, you gather any paperwork you have. Property deeds, old environmental surveys, anything that shows the importance of that land. And don't sign a thing. Don't let them intimidate you." I exhaled. "Yeah, I'll do that." On my way back, a swirl of doubt pulled me into thoughts of my past, specifically how I ended up out here in the first place. After high school, I had drifted from one odd job to another, never feeling settled. Then my grandfather passed, leaving me the cabin. I moved in, originally thinking it would be a temporary pit stop. But the lake and the surrounding woods called to me in a way I couldn't explain. Over time, I discovered I didn't want the hustle and neon of city life. The gentle rhythm of the water, the hush of towering pines, and the serenity of starlit nights kept me here. Now, these suits wanted to rip all that away. When I arrived home, I noticed the machinery had moved deeper onto my property. They'd erected a makeshift fence around an area near the shoreline, posted warnings of future site of Lakeshore Grand, an HOA development. My anger flared all over again. I marched up to the fence line and glared at the men in hard hats. One of them paused to nod in acknowledgement, then went back to drilling or measuring. I realized with a sinking feeling that they truly believed they had every right to be here. I decided to walk down to the lake to see what was happening up close. As I approached the shoreline, the manager with the expensive watch, whose name I learned was Greg, stopped me. "Sorry, sir," he said in a tone that suggested he was anything but sorry. "We're working here. It's a construction zone." I scoffed. "You're on my land." He crossed his arms. "As I explained, we have full authorization. You'll be compensated according to the terms. But if you'd like to talk to our attorney—" "I know what you're doing, Greg," I interrupted. "But I'm not someone you can just bully. This place is protected in ways you can't imagine." His eyebrows rose. "Protected? Is that a threat?" "Not from me," I said, shooting him a glare, "from the land itself." It sounded dramatic, even mystical, but I couldn't help it. If Grandpa was right, if there was something in the lake, maybe it would help me now. He waved me off with an amused chuckle. "Look, I don't have time for ghost stories. We have a timeline to meet, and we're on schedule. I'd suggest you vacate this area for your own safety." A burst of frustration shook my voice. "We'll see who leaves." I turned away, refusing to let him see just how unsettled I felt. Admittedly, part of me wondered if I was being foolish to pin my hopes on some intangible force. Yet I recalled an incident from 2 summers ago. I was on the water in a rowboat fishing for trout when the wind died and the surface of the lake turned to glass. My reflection stared back at me, except it wasn't quite my face. It was older, gaunt, almost ghostly, and it seemed to mouth words I couldn't hear. It frightened me so badly that I rowed back to shore and didn't speak about it to anyone. I later dismissed it as a trick of the light. But what if it was something more? Putting aside the eerie memory, I spent the remainder of the day searching my grandfather's old desk for documents. I found a worn folder containing the original deed. Indeed, the property was purchased before the HOA even existed in this county. There were also old environmental checklists, references to a fragile ecosystem, plus some scribbled notes about local legends. Grandpa's spidery handwriting read, "The lake chooses who may stay," which gave me both comfort and a chill. Jody came by that evening, armed with printouts and a fierce determination. "So, from what I've gathered," she said, tapping the thick stack of papers, "the HOA might be overstepping. The area is at least partially protected. Also, I've discovered that the route they're using to claim eminent domain is questionable. It's typically reserved for government projects like roads, not private resorts. If this is truly a private venture, they shouldn't be able to invoke it." "Then how are they doing it?" I asked. "Could be some shady backroom deal. Maybe someone on the local zoning board is getting a payoff, but we can't just accuse them without evidence. We need to prove wrongdoing or find a legal angle." I nodded. "What if we go to the local news?" She pursed her lips, thinking. "That could be effective. Public pressure might stall construction. But the HOA is well funded. They can run slick PR campaigns that paint us as anti-progress. It's worth a try, though. At least it'll buy us time." Time, that was the key. If we could slow them down, maybe we could find a more permanent solution. Meanwhile, the day ended with the steady thrum of generators near the water's edge, lights illuminating the new fence line. As night fell, I couldn't sleep. So I sat on my porch, listening to the chorus of crickets, feeling that intangible hum from the lake. I swore I could hear it calling my name, urging me to come closer. I gave in and strolled toward the shoreline where the machines lay silent under floodlights. The moon was bright. I gazed at the water, imagining it might ripple or show me something hidden. At first, nothing. Then, as if in a dream, I saw a reflection that wasn't mine. An older man, hair silver, eyes sunken, staring back at me with an intensity that made my pulse race. He mouthed a single word, "Listen." The water shimmered, and the vision vanished. Shaken, I returned to the cabin, my mind swirling with questions. Was that my own future self, or was it my grandfather, or something else entirely? And how exactly was I supposed to listen? The next day, Jody and I reached out to local news outlets. Only one small-town newspaper showed interest, but it was a start. A young reporter named Carla visited to interview me. She was in her mid-20s, enthusiastic, wearing a press badge around her neck like it was a VIP ticket to a rock concert. "Mr. Moore," she said politely, "can you explain what's happening with the HOA?" I explained everything, how they'd invaded, the questionable legal claims, the environmental concerns. She jotted down notes, occasionally snapping a photo of the half-built structures near the water. "And how do you feel about them possibly destroying this land?" she asked. I paused, glancing at the tranquil lake. This place is more than land. It's alive. If they continue, they'll find that out the hard way. Carla blinked, uncertain how to interpret my statement. "You mean the environmental impact? Or is there something else?" My jaw tensed. "Let's just say there are forces at work here that people tend to overlook in their rush to develop. I'm not sure how else to explain it." She gave me a tight smile, clearly trying to keep the story grounded. "I see. Well, thank you. I'll do my best to convey your concerns accurately." After she left, Jody and I exchanged a hopeful look. Maybe that small piece of coverage would raise awareness. But days passed, and the only noticeable change was the accelerating pace of construction. The fence grew taller, a series of temporary structures sprang up, and the rumble of machinery became an ongoing soundtrack. Greg, the project manager, occasionally glanced my way with a mocking grin, as if to say, "Just try to stop us." One afternoon, I decided to survey the property line with a camera in hand, documenting any potential violations. Jody had advised me to keep records, especially if they ventured onto my official boundary. I walked along the tree line, snapping photos. To my surprise, near the far corner of my land, I discovered red flags stuck into the soil, apparently marking sections for future expansion. As I crouched down to snap a closer shot, I heard voices. Quickly, I ducked behind an old pine. Two men in suits were discussing something. The older one, with graying hair, said, "We need to expedite this or the board will pull funding." And that local guy, what's his name? Moore? He's making noise. The younger man, presumably an assistant, nodded. "We can't let him get in the way. I talked to the attorneys and they said if we can find a violation on his side, we can file an injunction against him. That'll keep him busy." "Good," the older man said. "Whatever it takes. The board has big plans. This is going to be a premier destination, and no recluse with a backward notion of nature is going to stop us." They moved on, not realizing I was within earshot. Anger bubbled in my chest. So they were actively seeking dirt on me. I'd always kept a low profile, paid my taxes, and obeyed the law. But maybe they could invent something or twist details. I hurried back to the cabin, where Jody was scanning legal texts on her laptop. I told her what I overheard. "Typical," she muttered. "We need to be even more careful. They might try to claim some code violation on your house or land. It's not unheard of for developers to push that angle. They get you tied up in court, and meanwhile, they keep building." I refused to let fear paralyze me. Instead, I devoted more energy to rummaging through archives at the local library, searching for anything about this lake or the area that might be a game changer. That's when I stumbled onto an old newspaper clipping from the 1950s. It mentioned a series of strange events near the lake. Boats drifting off course, people claiming to see apparitions, and in one instance, an entire construction site shutting down after multiple inexplicable accidents. Reading that gave me goosebumps. History seemed to be repeating itself. The article was vague, implying the land had a spirit that defends itself. Some workers refused to continue, citing superstitions. The project was ultimately abandoned. It made me wonder if the lake had a track record of rejecting unwanted developments. Back home, I told Jody. "It might not hold up in court, but it's interesting," she said. "Could be we see a repeat performance. Accidents, delays. It might buy us time." Sure enough, over the next few weeks, odd mishaps plagued the construction. Equipment malfunctioned. A crane operator swore the ground shifted beneath him. A surveyor complained his GPS readings kept going haywire. None of it was catastrophic, but it was enough to slow progress. Greg seemed more agitated each day, barking orders and blaming incompetence. Meanwhile, we took advantage of the delays. Jody liaised with environmental groups, Carla wrote follow-up articles, and I contacted a local activist who specialized in preserving natural habitats. Yet the HOA's official stance was unwavering. They had all the permits needed. They claimed the mishaps were normal in any big project. They also circulated glossy brochures around town, promising jobs, a boost to local tourism, and improved infrastructure. Some residents became vocal supporters of the resort, lured by the promise of economic growth. The tide of public opinion turned uneasy, with some folks insisting I was just a stubborn old hermit. That stung, but I tried not to let it shake my resolve. One stormy night, lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the half-built structures by the lakeshore. Rain pounded on my roof, and I felt an irresistible urge to go outside. Grabbing a slicker, I stepped into the downpour and made my way to the lake. My boots sank into mud as thunder boomed overhead. When I reached the water, my eyes locked on the reflection of the dark clouds above. Lightning lit the surface, and for a split second, I saw the face again, that gaunt, aged face. This time it mouthed more than one word, though I couldn't make them out. Then a voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered in my mind, "Defend us, or lose everything." My heart thundered along with the sky. Was this some manifestation of my own subconscious, or was the lake truly speaking to me? Whatever the truth, I knew I couldn't let the HOA win. I sprinted back to my cabin and began scribbling notes, trying to capture the sense of urgency I felt. Over the next few days, more peculiar events occurred around the site. Workers reported hearing voices at night. Tools disappeared and reappeared in strange places. Greg complained that their expensive surveying equipment kept giving contradictory results, making it impossible to finalize building plans. The morale among the construction crew sank, and rumors of a curse spread like wildfire. Greg tried to quell them, offering bonuses for completed work, but the seeds of doubt were sown. Late one afternoon, I saw an older construction worker standing by the fence, gazing at the lake with a haunted look. I approached him carefully, not wanting to startle him. He turned, eyes weary. "You ever seen anything strange out there?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward the shoreline. "What do you mean?" I replied. "Something's off about this place," he muttered. "At first I thought it was just local superstition. But I've worked construction for 30 years and I've never seen equipment fail like this, and I swear I heard someone calling my name out on the water." I didn't offer a direct answer. Instead, I said, "Some places you have to respect them. Otherwise, they push back." He nodded, then walked away. I stood there a moment, the wind rustling through the pine needles, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth. Maybe the land was indeed pushing back, just like it had in the 50s. Despite these setbacks, the project didn't stop. Greg and the HOA were determined. They brought in new engineers, more advanced gear, and more money. Where the local crew faltered, they shipped in out-of-state workers with no knowledge of the superstitions. I'd see them arrive by the dozen, fresh faces who shrugged off the rumors, until they experienced something unexplainable for themselves. One day, Carla returned for another interview. "People are saying the site is haunted," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Your thoughts?" I chose my words carefully. Whether it's haunted or just an unfortunate place to build, one thing is certain: this land doesn't want them here. And I don't. She jotted that down. "So you feel vindicated by the project's difficulties?" "Not vindicated," I said. "Sad. Because if they keep pushing, something worse might happen." My voice caught, a flicker of genuine concern for the workers. They were just doing their jobs. Carla gave me a sympathetic nod and wrapped up. As she drove away, my phone buzzed. Jody's name lit up the screen. "Good news," she said when I answered. "We've got an environmental lawyer willing to review the situation, pro bono. She's not falling from the sky." I reached out to her through a friend at a conservation group. "She's legit, but we have to be ready with all the facts." I let out a relieved breath. "That's fantastic. Let's do it." In the following days, we compiled every document, every photo, and every news article. When the lawyer Monica arrived at my cabin, I was impressed by her calm authority. "This is quite a case," she said, scanning the stack of papers. "I've dealt with big associations before, and they often rely on two things: deep pockets and intimidation. However, if they truly used eminent domain incorrectly, we might have a path to stop them." She spent hours interviewing me and Jody, reviewing the suspicious city council approvals, and taking notes on the environmental significance of the lake. "We'll file an injunction," she concluded, "but we need a compelling argument that the project is harming protected wildlife, or that the HOA is abusing legal loopholes." As Monica prepared her legal strategy, I noticed a subtle change in the environment. The days were getting shorter, winter approaching. The lake's surface grew darker, reflecting the steel-grass sky. The sense of foreboding deepened. I watched from my porch as the last of the autumn leaves fell, swirling in the cold breeze. One crisp morning, I headed down to the water, sipping coffee to warm my insides. That's when I found something that stopped me cold. A cluster of dead fish washed up on the shore. They were mostly small bass and perch, their bodies stiff and eyes glazed. I'd seen occasional fish die-offs, usually in the hottest parts of summer, but this was different. The temperature was mild, the water quality historically good. Why were they lying here lifeless? I poked around, then noticed a rainbow sheen on the water's surface, like oil. My gut churned. Was it a chemical spill from the construction site? If so, that was huge. I ran to get my phone and snapped photos. This could be exactly the evidence we needed to show environmental harm. Greg was out near the half-finished resort foundation talking to a couple of workers. I marched over, phone in hand. "What is this?" I demanded, shoving the photos in his face. He looked at the screen and then frowned, genuine confusion flickering across his expression. "I have no idea," he said. "Don't accuse us of dumping anything. We follow all the guidelines. Show me." I led him to the shoreline, the stench of decay mixing with the crisp air. Several workers gathered behind him. One of them muttered a curse when they saw the fish. Greg's face hardened. "We have no reason to contaminate the lake," he said defensively. "I'll have our environmental consultant run tests." I snapped back. "That should have been done before you started building." He glared at me. "We're not barbarians, Moore. We're building a top-class resort, not a wasteland. The water tests so far have been normal. Could be something else." I bit my tongue, uncertain if I could trust him or if this was just another cover-up. Regardless, dead fish and an oily sheen wouldn't help the HOA's public image. It might strengthen our case significantly. Over the next week, the tension boiled over. Workers whispered about toxins in the water, worrying about their own health. The rumor mill churned out stories that the land was cursed and was now killing its own creatures in protest. Greg insisted they follow every regulation, but with public scrutiny intensifying, even some of the local government officials started to distance themselves from the project. Suddenly, the unstoppable force of the HOA seemed less certain. That's when the real bombshell landed. Monica discovered that the property line on their official diagrams had been deliberately altered. A few lines on a map shifted to include my Lakeshore in their domain. It was a fraudulent move, and she had the original documents to prove it. "They basically forged the county records," she said, excitement and outrage shining in her eyes. That was our smoking gun. Armed with this, Monica rushed to file an emergency motion to halt construction. Word spread fast. The local news picked it up, calling it a major scandal. Even Carla did an in-depth exposé, revealing the suspect cartography behind the resort. By the time Greg's legal team tried to respond, the court had already issued a temporary stop work order. Machinery went silent. Workers stood idle. The fence remained, but no progress could be made. For a moment, it felt like we'd won. However, it was only a temporary injunction, not a permanent resolution. The HOA's attorneys insisted they'd correct the paperwork and continue, claiming it was an honest mistake. Still, the momentum had shifted in our favor. Public opinion also tilted, with many residents outraged at the deception. One evening, as the court battles unfolded, I stood on my porch watching the moonlit lake. The water was placid, reflecting star-speckled skies. I felt a calm settle over me, and for the first time in months, I believed we might truly save this land. In that moment, a gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying a faint whisper. "Thank you." I couldn't say whether it was merely my imagination, the wind, or something else, but it filled me with a sense of awe. Perhaps the land was indeed grateful, or perhaps I was just relieved. But the HOA wasn't done. With their project on hold, they regrouped. Greg vanished from the site for a while, replaced by corporate spokespeople who gave carefully worded statements about correcting the record. They hired spin doctors to shift blame onto incompetent surveyors. Meanwhile, their lawyers piled motions against the injunction. Monica warned me it might come down to a protracted legal battle. "They have endless resources," she said. "We have to stay vigilant." As the weeks passed, a cold snap froze the lake's surface. Construction was mostly at a standstill anyway, but now Mother Nature ensured no one was building. I used the time to gather more evidence, searching archives, taking photos, and talking to local historians who recalled the aborted project in the 50s. Each new piece of information felt like adding a stone to a growing fortress of defense. In the midst of all this, I had a dream, or a vision, one icy night. I was standing on the frozen lake, alone, when the ice cracked beneath my feet. I plunged into the frigid water, choking and disoriented. As I sank, I saw shapes in the darkness, ancient spirits, or perhaps illusions. Then a hand reached out, an old man's hand, guiding me upward. When I broke the surface, I found myself on the shore, shivering but alive. I woke in my bed, soaked in sweat, heart hammering. Was it just stress, or a warning about how perilous this fight could become? At dawn, I stared at the frost-laced windows, thinking about Grandpa's words, "The lake knows." Maybe it knew just how far the HOA would go to see this through. Later that day, Jody phoned, her voice trembling with urgency. "They're pushing an alternative plan," she said. "They're telling the county they'll reduce the environmental footprint, create a nature-friendly design, but they still want to proceed. They've got some big investor backing them." My stomach sank. "They never give up, do they?" "That's capitalism for you," she replied darkly. "We need to show them that the public outcry won't go away. Local elections are coming up, and if we can show that supporting the resort is political suicide, maybe the officials will back off." We rallied again, contacting environmental groups, local activists, and residents who appreciated the natural beauty. Petition drives started, online campaigns circulated. Carla wrote more articles exposing every shady corner of the HOA's plan. It wasn't easy, but a groundswell of support began to build. Then came the day of the hearing, a crucial juncture where the judge would decide whether to extend the injunction or let the HOA proceed while the case continued. The courthouse was packed with attorneys, local officials, and curious onlookers. I sat next to Monica, my hands clammy. Across the aisle were the HOA's legal team, 6 or 7 well-groomed lawyers flipping through binders of documents. Greg wasn't there, likely advised to keep a low profile. Monica presented our evidence methodically. The suspicious boundary alteration, the environmental concerns, the local laws that appeared to have been skirted. The HOA's lawyers countered with claims that it was all a misunderstanding. They even presented a new plan for an eco-friendly resort, complete with green roofs and solar panels. The judge listened, expression neutral. At one point, Monica introduced a piece of crucial evidence, the official deed from my grandfather that showed the original property lines, along with the newer forged records. As the judge examined the documents, I could see a flicker of disapproval cross his face. The HOA's lead attorney attempted to spin it, saying a clerical error had occurred, but the judge didn't look convinced. In the end, the judge extended the injunction, ruling that construction must remain halted until a full investigation into the boundary dispute was completed. It was a major win for our side. The crowd murmured, some with approval, others with frustration. Outside, camera flashes popped as local reporters tried to get statements. Monica smiled at me. "This is good," she said. "Really good." Yet I knew it wasn't the final battle. The HOA would keep fighting, and it might be years of legal wrangling before a permanent resolution. Still, as I drove back to my cabin, I felt a weight lift. The land was safe for now, the lake free from bulldozers and toxic runoff. Winter snows would soon blanket the area, giving nature a time to rest and renew. Later that week, I visited the Lakeshore again. Thick ice spanned the surface, the wind carrying snow flurries across the expanse. No construction equipment marred the quiet. The place was serene, just as it had been for most of my life here. I recalled the faces I'd seen in the reflection, the whispers on the breeze. Perhaps the unseen power was simply the intangible bond between humans and the places they cherish, some deeper connection that resonates in our very bones. For a long while I stood there, letting the cold numb my cheeks. Then I whispered, "We did it, Grandpa, at least for now." The trees stood silent, but in the hush I sensed a presence, warm and affirming. I turned to walk back toward the cabin, each step crunching in fresh snow. As the weeks wore on, no further moves were made by the HOA. Their public relations machine tried to spin the story, but the boundary forgery scandal was a blow they couldn't easily shrug off. Investors pulled out, stung by negative publicity. Greg was rumored to have been reassigned, which likely meant he'd been thrown under the bus. I didn't shed any tears for him. When spring came, the ice melted and the lake sparkled under a gentle sun. Wildlife returned, birds sang, and the fish population showed signs of recovery from whatever minor spill had occurred. I busied myself fixing the cabin's roof and planting a small garden beside the porch. Life found its rhythm again, though I never forgot how close I'd come to losing everything. Jody stopped by with good news. The county was reviewing new conservation rules, partly inspired by our case. They might designate large portions of the shoreline as protected, she said. That would effectively prevent future developments like that resort. Congratulations, you helped spark real change. I grinned. Couldn't have done it without you. She shrugged, smiling. That's what friends are for. And I have a feeling the lake itself had a hand in this. Maybe, I said, glancing at the shimmering water. I like to think so. We stood there a moment, just taking it all in. Then Jody cleared her throat. So, you're going to stay here, right? After all this, you're not tempted to run off to the city? I laughed softly. Not a chance. This place is part of me. I'm not going anywhere. Time passed, and the legal battle raged on in the background. Motions were filed, counter-filed, and eventually the HOA tried to negotiate a settlement. Monica guided me through the process. They offered a chunk of money if I'd consent to a smaller, modified resort plan, but I refused. The judge's investigation continued, and with each new piece of evidence, the HOA's case weakened. By midsummer, they withdrew their development application. As part of a confidential agreement, they pledged not to pursue any further construction on my property. The details were hushed up, but the net effect was clear. The lake was free from their grasp. In truth, it felt anticlimactic when the final paperwork was signed, just me and Monica in a quiet office. But that was how real victories often ended, not with a bang, but with a pen stroke. Either way, we'd won. That night, I celebrated with Jody, sitting by a bonfire on the lakeshore. Sparks flew into the air and the stars twinkled overhead. We toasted marshmallows and talked about the future. It's crazy to think it all started with them just rolling in like they owned the place, Jody said, gazing into the flames. Yeah, I agreed, and now they've backed off. She gave me a sidelong look. You know, a lot of people might have just taken the money and run. I'm not one of those people, I said with a chuckle. That's why this lake is still here, she replied softly, picking up a stick to poke at the embers. The next morning I woke early and wandered down to the water. It was calm, reflecting the dawn sky in soft pink and orange hues. I crouched at the shoreline, letting my fingertips graze the water's surface. It felt cool and alive. In that moment, I thought about the deeper meaning of what had happened. The clash between reckless development and a land that demanded respect. I remembered the disbelieving looks on the developers' faces, their inability to comprehend that they couldn't just conquer everything with money and paperwork. I thought about how the lake had shown me reflections of something beyond the ordinary, giving me a sense of purpose and, perhaps, a mysterious assist. Finally, I stood up and took a deep breath of the clean morning air. Life here was simple, but in that simplicity was everything that mattered. Peace, connection, gratitude. This land was a gift, not a commodity. In the end, the HOA discovered what true ownership meant. Land is not just a plot on a map, and nature is not merely a backdrop for luxury homes or resorts. There's a responsibility that comes with living close to wild places, a responsibility to protect, to listen, and to coexist. When we forget that, the very ground beneath us finds a way to remind us of its power, whether through mysterious visions, inexplicable mishaps, or simply a unifying resolve among those who cherish what can't be bought. Above all else, we learn that standing up for what we love often calls us to face bigger forces than we ever imagine. But armed with truth, determination, and a respect for the unseen connections that bind us to our environment, we can prevail. That's a lesson for anyone battling what seems unstoppable. Sometimes the greatest power is quiet, unseen, and beyond the grasp of those who only see value in a price tag. Ultimately, the land endures, and if we show it reverence, it stands with us in return.